Welcome to Tokyo Alumni Podcast. This is our 29th episode today. Today, our guest is a partner at a law firm based in Boston, Massachusetts called Mintz. She has been practicing corporate and securities law for 26 years, 20 of which have been with Mintz. She primarily represents publicly traded companies on equity financing, strategic mergers and acquisitions, and compliance and corporate governance obligations. When she's not practicing law, she's passionate about travel and serving on nonprofit boards. She's currently on a board of directors of the Japan Society of Boston, Greater Boston Legal Services, Lawyers for Civil Rights, and the Pine Street Inn, which is Boston's largest homeless services organization. She graduated ASIJ in 1987, and she also attended Yokohama International School and International School of Sacred Heart. She received her undergraduate degree in Japanese studies from Wellesley College and her law degree from Boston College Law School. She lives in South End of Boston with her husband, Bill Whelan, and their Cavalier King Charles Spaniel, Angus. Whenever she's able to do so, she also spends time at their condo, ASIJ, Tokyo. Welcome to the podcast, Megan.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here.
Well, today we'll talk a bit about law, but I also want to sort of touch upon ASIJ as well as international school in the 80s, right? You attended not just ASIJ, but Sacred Heart and YS. Just to double check, what were the exact years you were at those three schools?
So let's see. So YIS would have been 1974 to 1977. Sacred Heart was 77 to 80. And then ASIJ was 83 to 87.
So we went to all three schools. So far, all 28 of our guests have been graduates from the late 90s. I think as young as 2014. How was it there in the 80s in comparison to today? And, you know, you still visit Japan quite frequently. I think you said something along the lines of virtually every year. Have you been able to check out the campuses and I guess see, first of all, the physical changes?
Yeah, so I have been back to ASIJ probably more so than either of the other two schools. And one thing that is clearly very different is how much security there is now around the building. Back in the 80s, this was certainly before 9/11 happened, and you could come and go completely freely into the campus without checking in with anybody. So there was no gate out front, there were no guards. It was kind of a freely open environment, so that has changed. I guess I would say that the physical plant at ASIJ has many of the same elements in terms of just where the buildings are, but I feel like the buildings themselves have been enhanced and improved in many ways. So I was most recently at ASIJ for my 30-year high school reunion, and we got a tour of the whole facility, and I was just so impressed with the science facilities and the gym and the library and just everything. Was so like new and just seemed incredibly well done. And I think that it was when I was there in the 80s, I felt like it was a really impressive place then, but sort of coming back, as an adult, you get a real appreciation for just, I think, how lucky the kids are to go to school there, because the facilities are equal to, if not better than, many universities in the United States. So it was that was nice to see.
So when you went back for your 30-year anniversary, how many other people were there? Because I know it's even from my class of 2005, it's really hard to get people together.
Yeah, I feel like my class has a really great sense of spirit, and I feel like there's a lot of people who do still come back. And I think that for the 30th, there was sort of a sense that, this is a really momentous one, and it hadn't been held in Tokyo for many, many years, if ever. I'm trying to remember the last time it was actually held in Tokyo. And so I want to say that there were at least 30 or 40 people who came back the reunion. Wow. And those were not all people from abroad. Some people who attended live in Japan, so it was a shorter trip for them. But people came from Australia and the United States and Europe and just all over the world, literally. So it was a fantastic time to be back.
That's amazing. 40 people. I mean, I think for our 5-year, that was about what we had. So
yeah.
You graduated ASIJ, you focused on Japanese studies, and this is a question I often ask, people who go into law. So what point did you decide law school? Because, Japanese studies is not probably the most common major people take before entering law school.
Exactly. No, it's true. So I have actually always wanted to be a lawyer. So I have an aunt who is a lawyer, or she's retired as a lawyer. But when I was growing up, I just always thought that is what I want to do. Like, I just thought what she did was really interesting and cool. And, for whatever reason, I just thought this is the path for me. And I think the good thing about law school, one of the good things about law school, is that you don't have to take any particular course of study in undergrad in order to go to law school. You can literally study anything. So it's not like pre-med where I think basically have to have some prerequisites before entering medical school. You could go to law school as a pre-med student, or accounting or literature or whatever. So it was pretty flexible in that regard. And so, when I was in college, I figured, law school is probably what I'm going to be doing. And the Japanese studies was just where my real interest was in terms of where I wanted to focus my undergrad.
So when you complete your studies and you're deciding where to work, was Japan ever an option, or were you always quite honed in onto that East Coast market?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that one of the things that sort of looking back at my time in Japan, that I wish I had perhaps done a little bit differently, is that I was not a very diligent student of the Japanese language when I lived in Japan. So I did not learn it when I was a kid in a sufficient way that would allow me to use it in a professional setting. And so I just never kind of grasped onto that in such a way that would have allowed me, when I graduated law school, to get a job working at a firm in Tokyo. And I think one of the things that has really become the case now is that, there are so many people who are fully bilingual in, many languages, but Japanese, English, French, whatever. And so they have particular appeal for the firms that are hiring for the offices in Japan, or, other international places. You really, if you're going to work at even an international law firm in Tokyo, you're best served if you're fully bilingual. And I wasn't. I went to the Boston area directly from Tokyo when I graduated ASIJ, and I came to like the Boston area. I really hadn't spent any time here at all before coming here for college, and I liked it enough to stay. And then I got a job at a law firm in the Boston area, and kind of the rest is history.
Wow, yeah, that's a great point about the bilingualism. It seems to every 10 years, right? Even, when I graduated in 2009, it seemed to be even at that point. I joined a company in Japan. It was a foreign company though. And I thought, my abilities in English was a skill set, but it turned out the 10 other people in my so-called class, because it's kind of like school there, you have like a class, they all spoke English, and like one was coming from Oxford, the other was coming from Harvard, and I was like, okay, well, so much for appealing that part of my skills. Like, I had to appeal other stuff, which was different than I anticipated. When it comes to this idea of working in law, you've worked specifically a lot with this law, SOX. If you can maybe briefly explain to the audience what SOX is, as well as, I think people who watch any kind of law-related television often hear about mergers and acquisitions. It'd be kind of nice to maybe get like a 30-second version from someone who actually does it. because I think it's maybe
Sure.
oversimplified on TV. So yeah.
Right. Yes. No, that's definitely true. So SOX. So that stands for the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002, and that was, and we sort of affectionately abbreviated as SOX. It was passed in response to a number of high-profile kind of corporate governance failures in the United States. The foremost of which involved a company called Enron, where it came to light that they had essentially been falsifying their financial statements in ways that should have been brought to light by people in charge at the company. Sarbanes-Oxley, and there were other instances as well. There was a company called WorldCom, and it seemed to the U.S. Congress at the time that there needed to be a real kind of some additional rigor and discipline brought to the areas of corporate governance, and imposing various penalties if companies didn't impose rigor on their corporate governance. So there's a number of different rules that came into effect sort of after the passage of SOX, including independence of audit committee members, sort of heightened attention to who is on your board, who's on your various committees, and reporting, greater transparency of reporting about any conflicts of interest. Outlawed the ability to make loans for personal use to executive officers of U.S. publicly traded companies. It passed a section of the law that people really like to complain about. Is called Section 404, which relates to internal control over financial reporting. And it's a very costly set of rules to comply with for public companies. They devote a lot of time and energy and human resources to dealing with this law, but I think on balance it's improved corporate governance generally in the U.S. and therefore was worth doing. In terms of the mergers and acquisitions, so we represent both buyers and sellers of companies. If the board of directors of a company, just to start with the sort of selling side of the equation, decides that they have reached a point at which they think that the company's business is going to be attractive to a buyer, go out and do sort of a sale process by which they frequently will hire an investment bank to put together a sort of sale package for the company and take it out to different potential buyers under a confidentiality agreement, try to find some interest in buying a company. And then once that happens, once there's a sort of agreement on basic terms, we will work with the company to document the agreement. And so that can take the form of a merger agreement or an asset sale agreement if the company is only selling sort of a bucket of assets. There are a few different ways to do it depending on the state where the company is located. Sort of on the other side of things, when we're representing a buyer, usually a client will come to us after they've decided, we're interested in buying this company, and because we think it's got appealing, assets or technology or IP or whatever it is that they're trying to sort of capture and bring into their business. And then we'll work with the client on the transaction agreement. We'll handle a due diligence review where we take a look at all of the company's documents and patents and interactions with regulators and try to figure out if there's any sort of lurking issues that a buyer should be aware of before they proceed with a transaction. And then there's a number of different kind of ancillary agreements, as we call them, that sort of go along with the main agreement. And that's probably more than 30 seconds, but it's a
little bit more convincing than what they tell you on television, right? Where it seems like they you get 20 people meet in a big room and argue for 8 hours, and then they decide, all right, we're going to buy you.
It's both more extensive and probably more boring than what you see on television, but it does have its moments of interest.
And going back to SOX, I think you mentioned 404. I think I've heard basically any of the libertarians, kind of like a Ron Paul, or, sort of that's one they would complain about, right? Because of the costs.
Yeah.
So when it comes to stocks, though, one thing that has always intrigued me, and I hope this doesn't get into too esoteric of a territory, but there was a change about stock options, like in regards to what people can have. But it seems like that has not changed too much. So is that just my lack of observation, or like, because I know in 2000, there was another crash. It wasn't Enron, but there was the financial crash in 2008. Did that have any impact in regards to further enforcing SOX?
So after the 2008 crash, the U.S. Congress actually passed sort of a mini SOX act, which is called the Dodd-Frank Act, and that was intended to try to kind of reinforce and refine some of what happened in SOX that maybe wasn't quite grasping hold of things because of a variety of factors, including what you might call the kind of current political climate in Washington. A lot of some of the requirements that were supposed to be implemented under the Dodd-Frank Act actually haven't been passed yet, even though Dodd-Frank came out literally 10 years ago. So things can tend to take a long time, when some of these rules are implemented or involved. With respect to stock options, they're one tool that our clients use frequently to compensate employees. I think they're very popular. They can be very popular as a way of incentivizing people, trying to align, workers and employees' interests with those of the company's shareholders. One area that got a lot of focus a few years ago was a practice that really is not done anymore as a result of greater focus on it, is something called backdating of options, where companies would actually say, all right, well, the price has gone up, of our stock has gone up since we agreed to issue you these options. We're just going to try to turn back the clock and price them on a date where the price was lower. And
really?
That's, yes. And I think, the SEC basically said, you may not do that. That's not fair, to anybody other than yourselves, and it's certainly not fair to your shareholders. So they kind of put that right out of practice.
And I'm sure if the stock prices had gone down, I imagine they are rather silent about.
Yes. Right. Exactly. Yeah. But I do think, it's not that really doesn't happen anymore. But and nowadays we have clients who also give out restricted stock. So that's basically stock that is issued not in the form of an option, but an outright share of stock. And then you, as with an option, you vest into your ownership of the restricted stock over time, because I think the theory is that there has to be some period of time in which you're not sort of fully owning the share or the option. You need to stay at the company and over time sort of earn the full right to your compensation.
Interesting. And you've done a lot of mergers and acquisitions, period, but many have been involved with pharmaceuticals and therapeutic companies as well. And I was wondering, being involved with the mergers and acquisitions of, let's say, pharma, or let's say someone's involved with mergers and acquisitions of tech, how much of the knowledge of the lawyers involved have to be in regards to the M&A part versus how much of it has to be involved with the actual industry they're involved in? That's
a really great question. I think I would say that over the time I've been practicing, it has become more important for lawyers and for other kinds of advisors, but in particular for lawyers, to have an understanding of the industry in which they're practicing. And, the practice of law has become rather specialized in some ways, in the sense that, I consider myself an expert in the areas of corporate and securities law, but with a sort of backdrop of the biotech industry. If I need to ask one of my colleagues a question about, what does this patent say about the rights of this company to develop and formulate this product that they're working on, I would call one of my IP patent colleagues. So I wouldn't, there are people who are exclusively and solely focused on, how does this patent portfolio work? And many of those folks actually have PhDs in the particular scientific area, where the patents are being issued. And, those folks are really valuable to us as a firm because they have, very specialized knowledge. But, to your question, I think that, most of our clients call us because they know that we can get the transaction done. We can complete the merger, and we know the sort of technical legal requirements to get those done, and that's just assumed, that we would know that because that's what we're sort of paid to do. But I think having the biotech industry knowledge is helpful in being able to ask the right questions. So if I see something in a disclosure document that talks about an interaction with the Food and Drug Administration around a clinical trial that looks like there might have been a hiccup, or the agency was asking some questions, I know to ask the follow-up questions and get experts involved, on that specific issue if I need to do so.
That's really intriguing that you guys have in-house just people that you can sort of call up about various topics. And you say we've worked quite lengthy list in regards to mergers and acquisitions, as well as the companies you've consulted. Have there been any industries that you were thrown into that you were like, this, maybe this isn't like what I usually deal with? Like I see a lot of pharma, or I saw a lot of therapy, but was there any times that it was just like an entertainment industry or like sports industry?
No, that does happen every now and then. I did work on a transaction once involving the sale of a company in the media industry, and they made a technology that allowed a viewer to track a particular sports figure during a game. So it was completely not in the area of life sciences or drug development or biotech. And it was interesting, but I definitely didn't, I didn't have any particular knowledge to add to that discussion on their business, I mean.
That's interesting with the sports. Did you have a bunch of friends who were like, or were you not able to disclose that information of which athlete it was to your?
Yeah, no. They were very focused in Europe, and so they did a lot with like European soccer, which is not something that I think most Americans, I shouldn't generalize, but at least many Americans that I know do not follow European soccer. So there wasn't really much interest on that topic.
I'm very jealous. It sounds cool. This topic of, I feel like gender and race is something everyone through the international school, touch upon. And I want to start with gender because you were selected as, from Women's Business Boston, selected you as one of the top 10 corporate lawyers. You're obviously a woman in law. And you've been involved now for, 2 decades plus. So I'm interested to hear, how has the environment changed, evolved in the last 20 years, which I hope it has, or the lack of?
Yeah, it has changed, I think. And I think it has changed for the better. There are many more women in leadership positions at law firms than there were certainly when my aunt went to law school in the 70s. And that's been terrific. I think, there are certainly some firms do it better than others. I think, there are some firms that are known for just being really focused on the advancement of women in the profession. And Mintz is one of those firms. So I've been fortunate in that regard. But I do think that, my experience at ASIJ was a good grounding in sort of that going into that profession. It was the sort of school that did not, to me, at all in any way sort of discourage women from doing whatever it was they wanted to do. I always got the impression that, we could do anything that a man could do. And that was just reinforced by my experience at Wellesley College, which is an all-women's school. And so, by definition, they're very focused on their women students.
Yeah, that's good to hear that the numbers increased. And I remember in a previous podcast, someone was telling me about a 30% club. Guest was working at Standard Chartered. Is there sort of similar initiatives done as a occupation-wide project in the law industry?
Not that I'm aware of, and I've heard of the 30% coalition in that industry, but I don't believe that there is. I think the issue in large part for firms is retaining women as they get more senior in their profession, because right now, and I think this has been the case for many years, graduates of law school are coming out of law school at a 50-50 male-female ratio. And that's been the case for a while. And where people start to drop out is as they get more senior in their careers and they decide to do other things, and for many good reasons. But the firms need to be better about retaining women and making it possible for them to have kind of fulfilling careers in law firms at all stages of life.
Things are improving, but it's still maybe not quite where we want it to be.
Yep.
So when it comes to sort of racial backgrounds or, being a TCK, you'd be pretty much a model TCK. You spent, would it be your entire life during your formative years outside of the States?
No. So we moved to Yokohama when I was 4. And then we went back to Houston, Texas for my middle school years. And then, sort of before, so in Tokyo and then Houston, back to Tokyo and then Boston. So.
Okay, so you have an experience of both, but not TCK nonetheless. And questions I would have about, so, graduates prior to my time is when I got to the States, some people had impression of Japan that was a little different than maybe the reality. It was unusual, but maybe, 1 in 10 or 1 in 20 people were like seriously asking me about samurais and stuff, which is rather questionable maybe in the age of the internet and whatnot. But when you when you started, for example, university, what were people's impression when you were you lived in Japan for 4 years? Like, what kind of questions did they ask you?
Well, yeah, I remember getting some pretty odd questions, like they seemed to think that Japan was not in the northern hemisphere, for example. So they would be like, "Oh, is it winter now?" I was like, "No, it is not." I think probably the worst question I ever got was when we moved to Houston after our first time in Japan, and I told someone that I had come from Japan, and they said, "Oh, is that near Oklahoma?" And they just literally had no idea that it was a different country, like on the other side of the world. So, I mean, that was a long, long time ago. And the person was they were young. They weren't like a 30-year-old person, but still. I think that the biggest, culture shock for me coming to Boston from Tokyo, and honestly, I still feel it to this day, is just the fact that people in Tokyo are so polite and courteous to each other, and people in Boston are not, generally speaking. And I'm sure I've probably offended, many people listening if from Boston, but I'm more or less from Boston now, and it's just a different attitude. It's like, there is not a premium placed on being sort of courteous and not making a nuisance of yourself to other people. And I really, really miss that all the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you said about Boston, and hopefully what I'm saying is not controversial, but it's very uncontroversial, because almost every person I know from Boston tells me that it can get rough. Culturally, people are pretty rough there. But yeah, I agree with your sentiments about Japan. I've been gone now for 10 years and I still get sort of reverse culture shock when I visit, going, why are these people so nice to me when I just bought like a bottle of water?
Yeah. Well, I really, I haven't been, the last time we were in Japan was in January, and we were supposed to be going actually next week for the Olympics. But we can't because of COVID. So I miss it. Like, I'm really excited to go back.
Yeah, it's too bad that we're not able to travel too much right now. Hopefully things will be better next year.
So.
Well, at the end here, I like to ask the guests, what's coming up in the next few years, next few decades. So if you could share with us. I know you've already accomplished quite a bit the last few decades, but yeah, what's to come in the next few?
So I hope to keep working as a lawyer. I really enjoy, the work that I do. I don't necessarily see myself slowing down on that front. I would like to do more of my nonprofit work. That's been a really great experience for me, just in terms of balancing sort of the corporate world with worlds of people who are very not in the corporate world. So, and recently joined the Japan Society of Boston board, which is a terrific organization in Boston that has been around for many decades, but I'm just getting to know them. And I really hope to do more traveling when that's possible again. There are many countries in the world that I haven't yet seen, and I'm hoping to be able to see all of them.
Awesome. So yeah, your professional work, nonprofit work, travel. Wish you the best of luck. Hopefully this post-COVID time, will come, and then travel will come, and then maybe so I'll crash one of the 30 the 1987. Maybe the 35th.
It's a great group, so by all means.
And yeah, thanks for being on today, and have a nice day.
Thank you. Thanks, you too. Talk to you later.